It's May 13th, 2017. I'm with John Nicholson at Hilltop Studios, and we're talking about Jack Linneman and going back to when John met him the first time and tell some stories and some of the history at Star Day and then building Hilltop Studios.
Okay. Well, I started here in 1980. Jack hired me, just a green kid, knew nothing, never even been in a recording studio really. But I had experience in a band. I was a little drummer in a bar band, basically, from Lewis County, which is about 100 miles southeast of Nashville. And so, big dreams, and I thought, well, hey, I'm going to go to Nashville. And actually, I thought I was just coming up here to be a drummer. I didn't, like I said, didn't know much about recording studios at that time. Came up here and, naively just ask everybody, hey, you don't happen to need a recording engineer, do you? I thought that's the way it worked. Of course, it was easy for everybody to say, no, I'm sorry, son, we don't need anybody. Very polite, but no. And of course, drummers, by that time I'd figured out that these studio drummers knew a lot more than me, so that's backing up a little bit. That's the reason I wanted to become a sound engineer. I kind of bypassed the drummer thing real quick. But the reason I wanted to be a sound engineer, too, is the fact that, I was always the guy in the band that put the PA up and adjusted the sound, and it was all about microphones and speakers. I loved that stuff. As a kid, just learning a lot about it on my own with all the books I could read, stuff like that. So a keen interest in electronics and sound and stuff. So that sort of is what happened to me. When I did come to town and decided not to drum, I thought, well, hey, I want to be a sound guy anyway. So anyway, getting back to my story, nobody needed a sound guy, especially one like me that had no experience and pretty naive and all that. Until I looked in the phone book and I didn't know any of the studios, any people. My finger went down on one. About 8 or 10 later, it said Hilltop Studio. I said, oh, okay, well, here's one. I'll call him. And this is the interesting thing that happened next. I called, same kind of story I was going to say, hey, my name is Johnny Nicholson. I'm from Hohenwald, Tennessee. You don't happen to need a sound engineer. I made it real easy for people to politely say, no, son, we don't. But in this one case, I called Hilltop, and a miracle happened. At the time, they had a secretary working here, and she would get these calls all the time from kids, and then she would say the same thing, no, we don't need anybody, thank you for calling. Well, the one time I found out that I had called, she had actually went to the restroom, and Jack sat in there, Jack Linneman, and he sat in there at the desk. Here goes the phone ringing. Well, Jack, I guess I better get the phone. Secretary's in the restroom, right? So, Jack answers the phone. And, of course, again, I didn't know Jack or Hilltop or anything at this time. Said the same thing. Hey, my name's Johnny. You don't happen to need somebody. Well, Jack paused for a moment and said, maybe we could use somebody. And he told me where Hilltop was and all that. He said, why don't you come down and talk to me? And so that was a miracle in itself. The second miracle that happened for me that day was, again, here, a small town kid just moves up to Nashville in a big city and kind of lost and all that. Well, my apartment that I was staying at, actually with my brother, who was a Metro Police here in Nashville at the time. I was kind of just sleeping in his living room at the moment. It happened to be within walking distance of Hilltop here on Due West Avenue, right down the road. And so when I asked Jack, I said, where are you at? And he said, yeah, Hilltop Studios right here on Due West. I said, well, that's interesting. I'm living here on Due West. So I was living here on Due West Avenue, and Jack said, yeah, we're on Due West, so come on down and visit me. And I drove down quarter of a mile away, and I told Jack my story. Yeah, I used to be in a band, and I ran this sound and stuff like that. I tried to impress him with my knowledge of audio, and he said something funny. He said, well, I'll try not to hold that against you, but I'm going to hire you anyway, just because I think he liked me. We got along good, and he just saw, I guess, potential in me. Jack was he was a good people person. He could see somebody and I don't know, just know a little about you. And evidently, Jack saw enough in this naive kid here from Lewis County that he thought, you know what, that guy has something, just I guess in the way I was talking or whatever. So anyway, he hired me on the spot. Now, needless to say, I wasn't going to be the chief engineer that day. They had another guy working here named Kevin McManus, who's a well-known engineer. He was a chief engineer at the time. And so anyway, my job was basically I got hired on that day as the assistant engineer or coffee maker, whatever you want to call it, but that guy. So that got me in the studio. And by the way, Jack himself was an awesome mentor because, Jack goes way back to those Starday King days.
Let's talk about that history with Jack back that
Yeah, so he was a very good engineer. I found out all this later, that of all the records he had done, things like Cowboy Copus and say Red Savine, some of this early Starday King record stuff. He actually started with him, I believe, if I'm right, up in Cincinnati, I think.
I've been to that studio.
Yeah, and then they moved or built the Starday studio here in Nashville, and Jack came down with that.
You know what year that was?
I'm going to guess that was in the late 50s because he built Hilltop in 63. Okay. So he had been with Starday prior to that. So I'm kind of guessing it to be in late 50s, very early 60s. But Jack was also one of those guys who just had natural talent, not just in audio but electronics. It just blew me away. Here was a guy that could design circuits in his mind and just scratch them out on a piece of paper. And you could just say, I wish we had this thing that did this. And he goes, oh, okay, well, that would do this. Here's some capacitors, resistors, whatever it takes. He would always show me these schematics on paper. And, of course, he was always so far above my head anyway. I would just act like, yeah, that's cool. I really didn't know what he was talking about, but it probably would have worked, I'm sure. And also another thing that not only his engineering ability and things like that, but talking about the electronics, I don't think a lot of people understood that Jack was an awesome electronic designer. And Hilltop, when he built Hilltop in 63, not only was it a studio, but it also had became a little business that also had something called Hilltop Studio Equipment Company. And they built several recording consoles, and which I think today makes ones I know of in Arkansas that might still be going. But anyway, these were homemade boards, and they would design them from ground up, and that's what they used up until probably, actually when I started here in 1980, we still had two homemade boards, one in A room, one in B room. And that was in 80, and it wasn't until around maybe the mid-80s we finally got our first AMAC console, which are our first real made, if you will, commercial built console. So these consoles, these homemade consoles were actually very good consoles. And they sounded good, had lots of headroom. They were all Class A electronics.
Do you know if they were what the components were?
Well, it was Class A. It was certainly before chips. I mean, let's say real components, real capacitors.
Because some of them used Longevin parts and
yeah, I'm not sure. I remember seeing some parts around here, and speaking of Longevin, some Longevin faders in a box and stuff like that. Alps faders, I think, were in it. I don't think P&G's at that point, but transformers and stuff like that would go into it and pardon me for not knowing the name, brand or whatever, but it was an overbuilt console, built like a tank. I mean, you could not distort
everything
the front.
Was probably balanced.
Yeah,
kind
balanced
of like the Flickinger over at Cinderella.
Yeah, it was overbuilt. I mean, it was built almost to military kind of spec, if you will. It was just a heavy thing, like I said, custom built, hand wired, of course, all that kind of stuff. It was interesting, but it worked for years and years. We in our 80s, I remember a lot of big gospel records were cut on that very console, as well as bluegrass records. So it served its purpose. And getting back to the studio that has that console now in Arkansas, they bought it from us when we, went to buy the AMAC, and they bought that one.
Do you know what the name of that studio is?
Yeah, it's Rainey Recording Studio in Drasco, Arkansas. And the funny thing is, too, later on, like I said, we had one in the B room also. And many years later, we got ready to put a new console in the B room. And again, so we were taking out the homemade console number 2 we had. Same studio bought that one, too. I don't think they ever actually put it in and installed it, but they bought that console, too. So they have both original Hilltop built consoles. And those weren't the only consoles. I think there were other consoles. And this is trying to remember what Jack said, but there was a little studio, trying to think, in Virginia, I think it was, that had one. I'll have to try to think of the name of that studio. But anyway, they had several of these little consoles around. And So Jack was a genius at that kind of electronic design. It was amazing. So I always admired him to do that kind of stuff. But anyway, and getting back to audio and his mixing abilities, he was very good. You know, he was what we call around here the king of the 2-track recording. You know, of course we had multi-track, but you know we'd have groups that would come in and he'd record them live to 2-track. Go home at the end of the day with your mixes, you know, in your hand. But he was very good at that. He had a good, keen sense of, excuse me, a keen sense of, you know, how it goes, how to balance things. He of course, he was a dobro player, a very good one, and made a few albums back in the day. So he was a musician. So he engineered like part of the band, if you will. He just felt like, you know, when things would come up and go down and how to balance things and make things sound good. Of course, he was all into things like mic placement because, again, coming from the era that he did, it wasn't all about EQ and everything. It had to sound good from the point, you know, to get recorded. So he knew a lot about microphones and placement and all those kind of things. It made me, it made a good mentor for me, you know, when I learned from somebody like that. You know, you learn those basic things. And so Jack was a good teacher. But yeah, he was a natural engineer, and his records I think sound good. You can play them today, and they still have a good balance to them. You know. So.
Is there any others than the that you mentioned already that you can think of that he would be known for?
You know, I'm not sure it would. I can just say it was some of the early Start A King stuff. I'm not sure who all the artists. I want to say maybe some early George Jones was on that label. Maybe some early Dottie West, stuff like that. I'm not sure all the ones that Jack engineered. There was a combination there, a fellow named Tommy Hill that was big he was a producer over there. And they were a team a lot. Jack being the engineer, Tommy being the producer, you know, they would work on those records together. I know the big song Teddy Bear was one of the ones that Jack had engineered.
Yeah, and John Denny pinched that song to Red Sovine when Red was cutting his lawn.
Really?
John Denny's an old friend. I just acquired Denny Music Group.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that
Teddy
was
Bear's big record.
Yeah, huge record, and that was an interesting time. And the reason Jack told me he built Hilltop, which ironically is just half a mile from the old Start A King Studios, it's very close nearby here. Jack wanted to build a place that was quality, but made for more of the independent artists. You know, prior to that, there were some good studios around, but they kind of catered to the major label or the bigger budget things and stuff like that. They were costly studios. Jack wanted to see a good studio, but for an independent artist, you know, that they could go to that had similar kind of stuff or design as the bigger studios were. So that's the reason he built Hilltop, you know. And when he did, all of a sudden he had an abundance of business, mainly in the Southern gospel market, the trios and quartets and little country bands, things like that. Finally had a good place they could go that they could afford, and this was early '60s at that. And it's always been that way, even to this day. All these years later, Hilltop still caters to that same kind of business. It's still our bread and butter, the independent artists, and it's always been that way. So Jack laid down a good foundation for a business model here at Hilltop. And speaking of Hilltop, arguably anyway, it's one of the longest running recording studios in Nashville. Again, starting in 1963 and hasn't stopped a day since.
Yeah, that's just 9 years after Owen did the Quonset Hut.
Yeah. And again, not stopping, and it's been in business since that day. And I tell people this, they laugh every time I say it, but the phone number's still the same as it was in 1963. I don't know if you had to dial the first three digits at that time,
you didn't,
but
probably.
Our 5272 number is still the same. And that's kind of weird, isn't it, that something like that stays the same. But with over 50 years now in business, it's still going strong, so. Personally, I've been here for 37 years now, and which is hard to believe that I got to, I've been blessed this long to get to do this for this long, and hopefully a little longer. So, but Jack's legacy lives on. Of course, his son Billy was partners with him in it, and of course Billy went on to become the Opry bass player and a very popular session player, and a good engineer at that. A lot of people don't think about Billy Linneman as being a good engineer.
Oh, so he engineered here too.
Oh yeah, back in the early days, yeah, and he was a good engineer.
I need to get with him because I know that he lost the bottom of both of his legs.
That's true. Yeah, he sure did.
I've talked to him on the phone and let him know about it.
Yeah.
Because it'll June 4th at the Country Music Hall of Fame at 2:00.
Oh, good.
Will be the.
Yeah. Well, he could certainly share a lot of stuff, about the studio and his dad Jack and all that kind of stuff. And but yeah, they worked together on that. A lot of that. When Hilltop was first built, just the lower part was the bigger studio, what we call the tracking area. Mm-hmm. That was the recording studio. And the top part, where we're at today in this B studio, was actually part of their apartment then. Jack and his wife lived in the top part, and of course the studio was usable downstairs. And Billy, the younger Billy Linneman at the time, actually lived downstairs in a room in the back that today is more or less an amplifier room or storage room,
mm-hmm.
But anyway, they lived downstairs, so it was a home. It literally was a home studio.
I can remember coming out in the late 70s, I guess.
Yeah,
doing something,
Yeah, and they were here
before I started work for Marty in '79.
Yeah, yeah, they lived here, and it wasn't until I bought the studio from Jack in 1994. That I made the top part, more usable studio. So I created the B room. At that point, just before I bought the studio, Jack, it's kind of funny. They were divorced, but they never left the building. So she stayed in the original apartment, Jack's ex-wife, and so Jack had to have a place to go. So even though we had originally had a B room where we're sitting right now going, it was closed down to become Jack's apartment. So this studio in here became Jack's apartment. So he lived here, a few feet away. She lived in the apartment. It's kind of an interesting situation. And, of course, we just recorded downstairs. And when I got it, I converted. Jack had moved out, obviously, and so I converted the B room back to the B room again, a recording studio. And I made the offices into where her apartment was. So I kind of ended up using the whole space here for Hilltop needs, But that was kind of funny having them up here, living here like that.
Do you have any pictures that we can get of the original studio and then maybe how it changed over the years?
I think I've got a few, and I've actually been trying to get more of those. And thanks to the internet and stuff, I'm finding people that have some of the old photos of when they recorded a long time ago, and I have a handful right now. But I call them my legacy pictures, and I've got some on my website, but I will get you those. But I have one or two great pictures of Jack engineering a session downstairs in a control room with a homemade console. And matter of fact, it was an earlier homemade console than the one that was here when I started in 1980, so it was a very early console. So more about the earlier ones he had built, But anyway, it shows him sitting at this console. Probably they were 8-track maybe at that time.
How many inputs? 12?
Pardon me?
12 inputs, you
Something
think?
like that, yeah. Yeah, you see that, and you see several Universal Audio 1176s around, some LA2As, I think, things of that era, But there's a good picture of him. It's a black and white picture even, which makes it even cooler to me. But there's a group, it looks like maybe a gospel group. They're kind of leaning over, look at the console, and he's doing something on the board. But I've got that. I've got 2 or 3 others. I've got some from the late 70s into the 80s when I started and when Kevin McManus still worked here. But I really cherish those that I can find that of prior to 1980 or so back. I would love to have more from 63 on. And I tell you an interesting thing. It was maybe about 5 years ago. A guy calls me up on the phone, and he just kind of inquiring about, hey, how are things going at Hilltop? He said, I was there a long, long time ago, and I just curious if you guys are still in business and all that. So I'm talking to this guy, and he said that he had cut the very first session ever at Hilltop Studio in 63. Wow, man! And I wish I had asked him if he'd had a copy of his whatever he had done. But I thought that was so interesting to talk to the first person ever.
Yeah. How long was Kevin here?
Kevin started in around 77, 78, I think, and went through about mid 80s, maybe 85, something like that. So about 10 years or so. And Kevin and I worked alongside beside. When I started in 80 and he left in 85, by that time, about a year later after I got hired, I started actually doing sessions, So he and I did almost all the sessions at the time. Jack had kind of phased out for the most part. He would do once in a while, but he was leaving it primarily up to me and Kevin to do everything. Billy would actually come in and do a session here and there, but Kevin was the chief engineer. I was the other engineer, so between us both, we kind of handled everything during that time. And then Kevin left to, go start Oak Valley Studio, basically, and he stayed there for many years. And interestingly,
that was with Gene Lawson.
No, Gene.
Oak Valley?
No, Gene was a Reflections. And there's a story about Gene. Gene worked here. He was an engineer here in the 70s before he built Reflections. It kind of goes like this.
Did he build Oak Valley before he did Reflections?
Well, Gene didn't build Oak Valley. Gene, there's another guy, Henry Slaughter, built Oak Valley.
Okay.
I don't think Gene had anything to do with Oak Valley.
Somewhere recently I just read that he was there, and then they slaughtered him, had a thing.
Okay.
And then he built Reflections.
Maybe so.
But
Maybe I didn't know. I know that Gene.
So I need to get together with Gene.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to know. But I know that Gene was an engineer here in the 70s. And then Kevin came along. Well, it's sort of like Jack was the main guy, and then Gene replaced Jack, and then Gene moves on, and then Kevin replaces Gene, and then as time goes, I ended up replacing Kevin. But Gene was here for quite a while, and then he went to build Reflections.
Okay.
Matter of
that
fact,
wasn't until 80.
It would have been in the 80s or something like that. I know, or was it even 70s? I don't know. Maybe late 70s. I know when I started here in 80, Gene wasn't here, but he had been here in the 70s, so late 70s. So I would think that he probably started Reflections based on that would have been in the late 70s, maybe just guessing 77, 78, maybe something like that. Because I know that he and Kevin didn't work here at the same time. So I would think the switchover happened somewhere in the late 70s when Kevin started.
David McKinley told me a story yesterday about Jack made this box at Star Day. And people would call to try to, because it was a new kind of echo sound. And so many people were calling that John Hill, the producer, and him,
for Tommy
went in and they wanted to take this box apart so that they could reconstruct it, and sell it. And it all came apart. And and Jack never did get it back together again. But all of a sudden, Starday had this really cool chamber sound, and it was like a slap kind of thing that he had done, and then it all fell apart. And
no!
Yeah, I never could figure out how to put it back together again.
Wow, that's crazy.
So, can you think of any other gear that Tommy might have done? Did he build plates or?
What Gene did, Gene built that plate reverb, and we got one, the original one. Yeah. Well, we got one that Gene built when he worked here from that time, and it was, we don't use it a lot today, but at the time, before we got into Pro Tools and plugins and all that kind of stuff, and digital reverbs. Anyway, it was an awesome sounding plate. And anyway, to this day, it's still here and hooked up to our console.
Yeah, I've got to get a top plate for mine, because I bought out Lalamuk's studio.
Oh, okay.
And one of them didn't have a plate, just had a wire that you just kind of tied.
Man, you know what? At one time, I think they've all been destroyed, but when I first started here, again, we have this room in the back, and again, Jack, was into building, these custom console stuff. So there's parts and stuff always, and parts bins, faders, and capacitors, and knobs, and pots, whatever. But also in the back, there was this whole stack of 4x8 metal. I'd say about that thick. Maybe there must have been 15 of them there. So, and they were Gene Lawson plate metals that go in these plate reverbs. And Gene would go through these things, and how you tap on them, and then you make a certain sound. He would hear one that was just right, and that would become a Lawson plate. He'd hear another, no, that one's not good, kind of scrap it. But there was a stack of these things back there, just raw metal, 4x8 sheets of metal, plate. And I always thought that was funny. So that goes back to when Gene was working here as an engineer, and he was getting into making these reverbs, and they had ordered a bunch, and they just happened to be, that's where they were stacked up at. But I don't know whatever happened to all that stuff. It's all gone now, but somehow in the midst of cleaning up or whatever, you just think, well, we don't need that
Maybe
junk
Gene
no more.
came over and got him or something.
He may have. I wish I knew the story on that.
Because Gene's still with us, I think.
Pardon me?
Gene's still around.
Yeah, he's making the microphone, and he lives, where Reflections is.
Mm-hmm.
That little house right next to it is his microphone factory. So
I've called a couple times, left messages, but he never gets back to me. But
that's it. Well, I don't know why.
because I need to run over and get an interview.
Yeah, I don't know. I see him once in a while. I've got one of his mics that I actually like a lot. One of the later ones, the 251 model.
Mm-hmm.
And once in a while needs a tube, it'll get noisy or something, and he's good about just putting another tube in it. And I'd visit with him, or something. And
Do you remember what tube's in there?
I don't know what he's using in
An
there.
EC81 maybe?
Something like that. Yeah, I mean it's his copy of the 251. Well, the 47. He's got what it is on the power supply. It's got a switch for 47 and a 251. You choose which one through the power supply. Somehow, yeah. And so, it's funny that it's on the power supply, but you flip it there and it gets brighter, and it's supposed to be the 251 kind of sound, or the more milkier sound is the 47 sound, but it's done on the power supply itself. So I assume that he must have an EQ circuit or something in there at that point in there that changes that. But
So besides building consoles, did he ever build anything else when you were here, or that you can talk about?
yeah, you're talking about electronics. I think he did. I know. I want to say that he built. Well, of course, the reverb thing that you're talking about, I think he got into that a little bit, but consoles were his big thing. But I want to say that he built, what was it, maybe a compressor or something, or an EQ, but he didn't build a lot of those kind of things. I think the consoles were the biggest thing that he built. Now, he wanted to build a lot of stuff outside electronics. I got a funny story when I first started here with him. A year or two goes by, but anyway, he's got this whole Volkswagen Beetle outside. And he had a jigsaw, and I come to work, and he's on top of this Volkswagen, just cutting the top off of it and everything, just making a convertible basically out of it. And I said, Jack, what are you doing there? And he said, well, I'm going to make a Volkswagen pickup out of it. And anyway, he did. It was the ugliest thing I ever saw, but he ended up putting plywood on the back, making a bed, and
How'd you get to the engine?
Well, it was like below the plywood, and then he somehow sealed up the back of the cab, or back of the, where he sawed it off to make a cab. So he's always doing stuff like that. And also one time he hauls in this airplane, like small experimental airplane, and that he never finished, but he was going to work on that. So he always had fun monkeying around with stuff outside, cars and things like that, But he wasn't afraid to take a saw to a car or a van or whatever he had. Just let's make something out of it, So he was really always into piddling, I call it, around with things, So outside the studio, it didn't have to be electronics. He was into everything like that. So he's fun, and he's a great ping pong player. He could absolutely whip my tail. I tried and he was much older than me, but I could not play against the guy. We had a ping pong table set up here at Hilltop, and he always wanted to play ping pong. If we weren't doing a session or something or whatever, he said, hey, let's go play some ping pong. And, of course, here I am I'm on the payroll, so, yeah, I'll play ping pong with you all day long. And, man, it was frustrating, though, because he was so good. So, I don't know. That's just a little side bit about Jack there. He's a great ping pong player.
Looking back at Jack's career, what do you think that he'll be remembered the most for? Besides building Hilltop, but everybody has their special gifts, how they get along with people and people skills. And
well, Jack was a very comfortable guy to be around. He was funny, soft-spoken kind of guy, and knowledgeable. I never remember Jack, getting mad at anybody and yelling or anything like that. So he was a comfortable guy to be around. So I think, to sum it up, Jack was just a nice guy, and a talented guy. So, I can't personally. I owe my whole audio career to Jack, because he was that one guy. Remember, way back in the phone book, he was the one guy that I don't think if he had answered the phone that day, I don't know if I'd be doing this today, because I really didn't have credentials at the time or anything that would should have put me in this position. So between Jack and God, that put me at Hilltop, but Jack gave me the chance, so I owe him a lot for that. But yeah, as far as being remembered, I think a lot of people that might not have known his engineering and all that stuff would just say, man, what a great guy. He's a nice guy. I always like Jack. You hear that a lot. He's a fun guy. And people that do know about Jack's audio career would say, he was a good engineer. He could really mix a 2-track album or a designer. He knew circuits. He knew how to do stuff. So pretty interesting fellow. So I think, yeah, he's going to have a good legacy.